All right, hello. This is the learning progressions of numbers and operations fractions, grades 3 through 5. This is by Allison and Colleen. So the first domain that we are looking at for operations and fractions is the standard 3NF A2A that we're going to be focused on. So what we're going to be focusing on for the students is basically how they're going to represent a fraction on a diagram, on a line diagram. Our goal for this is for them to understand their prior knowledge, they have not really dealt with fractions before. The two standards that we're pulling for from second grade would be from the geometry, where they're breaking shapes into halves and 1/3 and 1/4, but we don't quite dive too much into fractions. And then also we're going to be pulling from the measure and data, where they are learning how to draw line diagrams with just whole numbers. And so how they're drawing those to scale. That's the prior knowledge that we're going to be pulling from, because they don't have any before that, really. So the essential question we need to focus on is, how do we know where to place them on the number line? So they need to understand, for conceptual knowledge, they need to understand how many pieces of a fraction are shown on that diagram. So let's say we have a fraction of 1/4, and it starts at 0 and then to 1. They need to understand how to break up that fraction. So let's say they're trying to put 2/4 on the diagram. They need to understand how many pieces they're breaking into and then how to properly place that on the diagram. So they're not just putting 2/4 really close to 1. They need to understand the scale of it. So then let's go into the procedural fluency. They need to identify how many. So like I said, with the 1/4, they need to understand how to separate that onto the number line. So that's kind of the conceptual and procedural kind of pushed into one for what they need to understand. The example we're going to use a math center. So the activity for this is they are going to be using a large number line on the floor. This is a class activity kind of, so you'd go to each center. So they get a tick, which has tick marks, which actually has a fraction on their line. And what they're going to do is they're going to be finding where they need to place that on the number line. So it's interactive, they get to move around, and each student is given a different role and responsibility within that they need to answer. Some of the academic language they need to focus on is partition, fractions, numerator, denominator, and diagram, because that's what they're working towards with the fractions. In order to assess them, it's going to be very informal for this one. The teacher will be walking around and being able to observe, and they'll also be able to use their students' minds to help them kind of figure out where they're going or how they're doing with this. For the misconception, students count tick marks instead of on lines rather than the distance. So that's kind of something that they have a misconception about. The technology connection that they would use is Freckles. It's an online app. It's so awesome. I've used it in the classroom before. Students have video lessons, and they can drag and they get to play. It's, again, a very interactive and fun way for these students to learn. So on the next page, we have an example of kind of what we're talking about with their activity. So it's the line. They get to place it on the diagram, and they're trying to figure out where their tick goes. And then they record it on their data for the lines and fractions. They get to draw it out as well. And then that's another way to actually assess the students for the teacher. For grade 4, we focused on, we're moving on to the next one to expand on fractions. Now they're going to be comparing two fractions that have different denominators and numerators. So that's the big thing that we're going to be focusing on for that. as we said, the goal is for them to be able to record this and then to record it correctly with the symbols. So we have greater than, equal to, or less than to justify their conclusions. Something we need to think about for the essential question is if you have two fractions, how do you know which one is greater or has more value? So it's being able to compare, because you could have different fractions and one may look bigger because it has bigger numbers, but doesn't mean it has more value. So that's something that we need to think about. That also goes into our misconceptions of just seeing a bigger number doesn't necessarily mean it has more value. So that's a misconception with some of our fractions. And as we said, we're growing on our prior knowledge from our previous standard of just going from a number line diagram to moving on to more than that. So for our conceptual knowledge, we are comparing fractions to determine the value and then being able to understand that in a mathematical sense and using the terminology correctly. So either being able to say it correctly and then visually seeing it and being able to say that out loud with the symbols. So for the procedure, you need to determine the least common denominator as well, which is going to kind of be a new term to them. So that's something they're going to have to learn as well. And then being able to have the denominators get equal if you need to compare them. And being able to find the best way possible to do that. And then determine which symbol you're going to use to determine which one is greater or less than or equal to. We are also going to do math centers for this one. It's kind of a whole class math center. So what this is, it's going to be card wars. So what this is actually a very fun and interactive game for the students. So you have a partner, and what you have cards, and then each card has fractions on it. And it's kind of like war, so you flip it over, and then you have to decide who wins. So since not all the denominators are the same, they have to figure it out. So they get a new card every time. So it creates diversity within the game. And then they have to be able to write all this information down on their paper with their symbols, and so you can check it that way. The academic language is fractions, compare, numerator, denominator, symbols, greater than, less than, and equal to, and then least common denominators, something that they need to be aware of as well. So that's how we're going to assess them, by walking around as well. But here's kind of what we're talking about with our game. So these will be cut, the cards would be cut up and they would hold them in their hand like a deck of cards. And then they would play against their partner. And they would be writing what their card is. So let's say if they have 2/3 and then their partner's card was 2/4, they would have to decide if those are equal to, less than, or greater than. Something that could help them with this strategy for the symbols, they could use, I remember when I was learning, they could use the alligator for greater than, it eats it up. That's something that I just remember. It's just different strategies to help them compare and use the symbols correctly. Okay. So our last standard is our 5th grade standard. Our 5th grade standard is using word problems to solve and using fractions. So you're solving word problems with fractions or with fractions using addition or subtraction. So you have to determine that while the denominators are not the same. So you have to figure out how to do that now. Okay, so we're building on our previous knowledge of using word problems and then also using our fractions from before and kind of turning it into that type of terminology. You're taking, if you were in a market, what you're trying to build on is using everyday life into fractions. So their goal is to be able to solve involving addition and subtractions referring to the same whole number with unlike denominators. So what we have to really think about, what is an effective strategy for adding and subtracting fractions? That's what we're going to ask the students. What is the most effective way to find this answer? The conceptual knowledge that we're going to focus on is denominators decide the size and the amount of the pieces that you're getting. You have to be very aware of that. And also the whole number that divides